In this video, we discuss some of the basics of the biblical text as we move this week into the world of the text. And I've divided these basics out into three sort of related, but also kind of different from one another topics. The first is going to be choosing a passage for exegesis. How do you know what to choose and what length of a passage to choose? The second is some basics about translations and how translation philosophies work and play out on the ground level. And then lastly, the transmission of the text. So let's go ahead and jump back and start with the basics of choosing a passage for exegesis. If you are doing a final exegetical paper for this class, or if you are doing any of the world assignments, you will need to choose a passage of suitable length to do those assignments. So there's a sort of Goldilocks principle at work here, and this is one of the images that comes up when you Google Goldilocks, and I like this one because it is a you choose story where you choose your ending to the Goldilocks story, just as you are choosing a passage for exegesis. So the Goldilocks principle here is a passage that's not too long and it's not too short. You don't want to be overwhelmed by too much stuff. And the tendency for most students beginning in exegesis is to choose something that is too long rather than to choose something that is too short. Students tend to think, I will never be able to think this much about such a small amount of text, or I will never be able to write this much about this small amount of text. And then they get into the exegetical process and are very surprised how much one can write about even a single verse of the biblical text. So not too long, not too short. You also don't want to do something that's just a verse or two. You want to give yourself some room to sort of really explore the entire passage, and that is the whole unit of the passage. So as a general rule, my suggestion is somewhere around 10 verses. And I want to really emphasize the generalness of this general rule. It's not a hard and fast rule, but I start with the principle of when you are choosing a passage for exegesis, choosing one that is approximately 10 verses, or trying to cut down the passage to approximately 10 verses. And when I say cut down the passage, I mean sort of creating a well-defined unit that has a clear beginning and a clear ending to it, even if it's related to what comes before and what comes after in a close way. When you are sort of cutting out a passage or choosing a passage, you want to find something with a clear beginning and a clear ending. And there's various ways you can sort of determine whether or not the beginning and ending are clear to a particular passage. Another really important thing when choosing a passage to do exegesis on is to choose something that you are interested in. Exegesis, as we've said in the past, should be something fun and something that you enjoy doing. It's not sort of this scientific process where you are just approaching it with the white gloves and not bringing yourself to it, not bringing your own enjoyment to it. So choosing something that interests you, or something that might challenge you, or something that you have questions about. The sort of more curious you can be about a particular passage, the more productive your interpretation and exegesis of that passage might be. And then the last principle here for choosing a passage, particularly if you are choosing a passage for preaching, is to look at the lectionary text. That is, how does the lectionary divide out this particular passage? Or if you are choosing a passage to interpret for the purpose of preaching, taking a look at the lectionary text is a really good starting point to figure out what amount of text it is that you are going to interpret and then use, in this case, in a sermon setting. So to change gears here completely and move over to some basics about translations. So what a translation is at the most basic level is the English or another modern language that has rendered the Greek, Hebrew, and the Aramaic text of the Bible into that modern target languages. And like exegesis, I want us to be clear that translation is both an art and a science. So we use these metaphors when we introduce exegesis, and they apply to translation as well, that there are sort of rules to doing translation, and there are ways and modes to do it well. But just like exegesis, you are bringing yourself to the act of translation. And there's sort of an art to it, that it's something that different people are going to produce different products when they translate a text, and different translation committees are going to produce different products when they translate a text. And this is why we have a variety of different English translations of both the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament. And sort of linked up with this idea of translation being both a science and an art, every translation involves interpretation. It involves looking at the text in the original language and making decisions about how to render it into English that involves making interpretive choices. Translation implies choice, doing one thing instead of another. So those choices are informed by how one interprets the biblical text. So we should always sort of keep in mind that no translation, no matter how literal or word for word it might be, is not sort of a sterile objective thing, that there is always interpretation happening in the act of translation, and every English translation has interpretive decisions embedded within them. And lastly, translation requires an understanding of both the original languages, Greek or Hebrew and Aramaic in our cases, and the language into which the text is being put. For most of us, this is going to be English. So you not only have to understand sort of how the ancient language works, but you have to understand how the modern language works. So if you ever take Greek with me, you will hear me repeat over and over and over again. You will learn English grammar better by learning your Greek grammar and by taking this Greek class, because translation requires an understanding of both of those. And interpretation is happening on both ends. We are interpreting, when we translate, how to best put something into English in a way that is meaningful for our audience or for our ecclesial communities. As far as translation philosophies go, there are sort of two main ways that different translation committees, that is, different groups of people, that have come together to create translations. So all of the translations that you engage, the NIV, the NRSV, these kinds of things are done by committee. And these committees tend to take one of two translation philosophies that sort of exist on a spectrum with one another. On one end of the spectrum is the formal equivalence philosophy of doing translation. And this is really the sort of word for word way of doing translation, emphasizing the form, sort of the Greek form or the Hebrew form, matching up as closely as possible with the English form. And so formal equivalence translations are going to be more interested in preserving the original language in English as closely as they can, that they are going to try and find a sort of an English word that best represents the Greek or Hebrew word and use that same word consistently. Functional equivalence translations on the other end of the spectrum are more sort of idea for idea translations. They're really trying to look at what the idea of what a phrase, a sentence, or even an entire paragraph is attempting to communicate, and take that idea and communicate it in a way that makes best sense in the target language, in English. And so it's not as concerned with making the words match up one for one, but making the larger chunks of ideas correspond to one another. And oftentimes functional equivalents are attempting to be functional. That is to say, they are attempting to be very clear in the way that they express what they understand the ideas of the ancient text to be. So you can see here really how interpretation is at play, especially in functional equivalence translations, insofar insofar as they are making decisions about what the ideas mean in Greek, and then are interpreting and translating those ideas into how they understand the equivalent English or other modern translations to best represent the ideas that they had made translation and interpretive decisions about already. And so I don't say that one translation philosophy is necessarily better than the other. You may gravitate more towards one or the other based on sort of your ideology. In just a second here, I'll give us some principles of how we might use these different translations, but there are advantages and disadvantages to both translation philosophies. On the formal equivalence side, and the positive, some of the positives about formal equivalence translations is they don't smooth out ambiguities. If there's something in the Greek that is a bit unclear, they will often try not to make that ambiguity more clear, to sort of make a decision about that ambiguity, but sort of to let it stand. The next bullet point here, they really translate the same words consistently. So for example, the Greek word agape is going to be, in a formal equivalence translation, almost always translated as love, whereas in a functional equivalence translation, there might be a little bit more play with the English word, whereas something other than love might be used. So in a formal equivalence translation, if you see the same English word repeated over and over and over again, you can expect that it is translating the same Greek or Hebrew word, or that same word, that word is the same in Greek and Hebrew each and every time you see it repeated in English. And lastly, a functional equivalence translation is going to maintain ancient imagery. Sometimes this ancient imagery and metaphors are a little bit less familiar to us, but a formal equivalence translation, because they want to maintain sort of the word for word literalness of the translation, they're not going to change the imagery. They're going to maintain that imagery. On the negative side of formal equivalence translations, they can tend to be awkward and even sometimes sort of boring and wooden. And they also can give the illusion that they are objective. Because they are trying to do this sort of one-to-one correspondence between words, there can be this illusion that there's not interpretation happening, that they're not making decisions. But even at the one-to-one level, decisions always have to be made. So that really is an illusion, and different translation committees are going to be better or worse about sort of playing into that illusion or presenting that illusion. Some translation committees will say we are objective as possible. Others will say, while we're doing a word for word translation, we recognize that interpretation is happening here. Over on the functional equivalence side, the advantages of the functional equivalence translation is that usually they don't claim to be objective. They straight up say, you know, this is what we're doing this idea for idea kind of thing, and we are making interpretive decisions as we go along. And this often makes for a more elegant, exciting, and fun read. That sort of, when you are reading in English prose that is more elegant, it's a bit more enjoyable to do. And sometimes the interpretive decisions that have been made are very, very clear, especially if you know what the sort of ambiguity or what the issue is within a particular passage, and then you look to a functional equivalence translation, you can say, oh yes, this is the decision that they made about this grammatical ambiguity or about this sort of idea on which there is debate. On the negative side of things, the functional equivalence does smooth out ambiguity. So if you don't know that the ambiguity is there in the original language, you won't necessarily notice it in a functional equivalence translation as quickly. And so whereas a formal equivalence translation will consistently translate a given Greek or Hebrew word the same way, a functional equivalence translation oftentimes will not do that. They will vary the English words that are used for a particular Greek or Hebrew word. And lastly, the sort of flip side of the formal equivalence translation, which maintains ancient imagery to try and sort of correspond to have that one-to-one word-for-word correspondence, oftentimes a functional equivalence translation will substitute ancient imagery with something modern. That's something that would be anachronistic or foreign to the biblical world, but makes better sense to us in English. And so I told you I would give you some principles for using translations that I don't necessarily think of formal or functional equivalence philosophies, one as better than the other. Rather, they have different purposes in different settings and for different uses. So for the purposes of study and for the purposes of this class, I would suggest you beginning with formal equivalence translations. And throughout your time in seminary, you have probably been asked to acquire different formal equivalence translations and utilize different formal equivalence translations. I think those are the best starting point for doing the process of exegesis, whereas a functional equivalence translation might be better for doing sort of personal reading of the text. And then in the process of exegesis, sort of as you get into the details or as you get into the weeds of a particular passage, doing a compare and contrast is a really profitable thing, insofar as it shows you the different, it really throws into relief the different issues that might be at stake in a given passage and how they are translated in different kinds of ways. And we'll see that in just a moment here as we go to a lecture pause. And the last thing I give you here is this sort of spectrum. So you can think of this word for word on the left side of the screen. That's the formal equivalence. And paraphrase is more like the functional equivalence. So sort of the furthest on the functional equivalence side is going to be a paraphrase like the Message, whereas the most literal or the most word for word is going to be something like the NASB or Young's literal translation. So what I want to do next is get a little bit hands-on with formal or functional equivalence. We're going to do a lecture pause here, and it's going to be a little bit quicker of a lecture pause. You don't actually need to write anything down for this one. We're going to look at 3 different texts, and what I want you to do is with each one, pause the video, read each of the texts. It's going to be the same verse in each case, and guess which one is functional and which one is formal, or sort of put them on the spectrum of formal to functional. So starting here with John 3:16, go ahead and pause the video and take a look at these 2 different translations. Guess which one is more formal and which one is more functional. All right, this one was a bit of a softball insofar as we have the sort of 2 extremes with this one. The second passage is going to be the most functional on our spectrum. It's from the Message, and you can sort of see how there has been a little bit more freedom in the translation. You sort of get a sense of that just from reading it. And then the top one is going to be the NASB, the most formal equivalent translation on our spectrum here. All right, let's move over to a different kind of text, a letter from the Apostle Paul, Romans 8:28, one of the most famous verses in the passage. Go ahead and pause here, read both of them, and take a guess which one is more functional, which one is more formal. This one is a little bit more challenging. So the bottom one, once again, is going to be slightly more functional. And it helps to know in this case that whereas the CEB has, we know that God works all things together. So notice here that the one doing the working is God in the CEB. The CEB, as do many translations on this verse, take a little bit of liberty in implying who the subject is doing the working. In the Greek, God is not explicitly stated as the subject in this clause. And so you see in the NRSV, and as you move towards the left to the more formal equivalence translations, they are not going to stick God in there as the subject of the action, even though it might be implied that God is the subject of the action, because they want to maintain that one-to-one correspondence. They don't want to put anything in there that is not necessarily in there in the Greek if they can avoid it. So the NRSV is going to just have, we know that all things work together. It doesn't say who does the working, though it's implied that God does the working. So you can see there how the NRSV then is a little bit more formal than the CEB insofar as they're not going to put in a word that is not necessarily there in the Greek. And our last one, a always fun passage from Revelation chapter 13, the number of the beast. Go ahead and pause here, read this verse, and guess which one is functional, which one is more formal. All right, so this is another difficult one insofar as they're relatively close to each other, and both are going to be somewhat formal equivalents. The second one, the New King James Version, a little bit more formal than the NIV. And the place this comes out, and again, it's helpful to know something about the passage in this case, is especially in this first phrase. This calls for wisdom versus here is wisdom. The New King James Version is much more literal insofar as the word here is actually here or is actually there in the Greek. Whereas the NIV takes a little bit more liberty and is implying something more about the idea of here is wisdom. So here is wisdom is the literal way of translating it, but the NIV has decided, well, we want the implication of the passage to come, or the implication of that line to come in a little bit more clearly and call the audience to sort of solve the puzzle or call to mind their wisdom. And as you move more to a paraphrase, if you were to go do a translation comparison of this passage, you would find that the more you move to the paraphrase, the more they're going to sort of reach out to the audience and ask them to call for wisdom or ask them to solve the riddle or solve the puzzle. I think this is the way that the message puts it. And then the one other way that we see the NIV being a little bit more paraphrase is by using a bit more inclusive language. With respect to let the person versus let him. In the Greek, we are going to have masculine pronouns here. The NIV is not necessarily always all that inclusive in its language, but in this case, it has, rather than having him, which would be more literal translation of the pronoun in Greek, has the person, even though the NIV later will have the number of a man rather than a human. The number of a human would be a bit more inclusive. But then again, that number is 666 in the NIV. His number is 666 in the New King James Version. That his is going to represent the masculine personal pronoun in the Greek better than that number of the NIV. So the NIV has paraphrased a little bit in order to be a bit more inclusive and not use as more sort of masculine forward language. And our last chunk of things to do with respect to the basics of the biblical text is to talk briefly about the transmission of the text. And the kind of exegesis or the exegetical tool set that is going to be really interested in how particular books of the Bible were transmitted is called textual criticism. Textual criticism is going to study manuscripts that contain biblical books, sometimes just one biblical book, sometimes several biblical books. And the goal of textual criticism is establishing an accurate form of the text. We'll talk more about textual criticism later in the semester, but it's important to introduce the concept here because it has much to say about the transmission of the text, and then ultimately what we have, the final version of the text, or the version of the text as we have it, is dependent on the work of textual critics. So a couple sort of basics about the transmission of the text, how it happened, and the form of the text. So our earliest New Testament text, and so here only dealing with the New Testament, not with the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament. The earliest New Testament texts are going to be written on papyrus, and here we have a fragment of John, by many counts dated to around 125 CE, called P52, or the John Rylands papyrus. This is a by most counts, one of the earliest fragments of a biblical or New Testament text, and it is written on papyrus, a certain kind of sort of paper or written medium. And again, when we talk more about textual criticism, we'll talk about what exactly papyrus is. Another basic principle that's important to keep in mind is that with respect to the New Testament and the Old Testament, we don't have any of the original texts. That is to say, we don't have any of the texts that were written by the pens of their authors. Everything that we have is copies, and sort of the earlier we move to the point of creation, the more texts are fragmentary. So you can see here with P52, this is all we have of P52. We can determine from the words on there that it's from the Gospel of John, but this is the only thing that survives. It's a very small little fragment. So when the further we move back, especially in the New Testament, to the early 2nd century and into the 1st century, we only have fragmentary text. And I should say, when we move into the 1st century, we don't really have text at all. So when we're in the early 2nd century, somewhere around 125 CE, if P52 is our earliest text, there's debate as to whether or not it is. The closer we get to the early 2nd century, the more fragmentary texts are, and we get larger chunks, more of a given gospel text, or more of a given Pauline letter or something like this, as we move forward in time, closer into the 3rd and 4th century. We get entire gospels, we get entire letters, or we get entire collections of gospels together. So multiple gospels together, multiple letters together, and then even in the 4th century, gospels and letters and sort of entire New Testament collections begin to emerge in the 4th and the 5th centuries CE. And the last note here is that English versions are going to be translated from reconstructed Greek texts, not from single manuscripts. So when you read your English Bible, or when you read your Greek New Testament, what you are reading is not a reproduction of one single New Testament manuscript. It is a reconstructed text. That is to say, textual critics have looked at all of the different manuscripts and determined what they think to be the best sort of representation of that biblical text. So they have reconstructed what they think, in most cases, what they think to be the earliest New Testament text, or the earliest version of the text, but it usually, or I should say, never really matches up with one single manuscript that represents that New Testament text. And so that's important to keep in mind as we think about how the text was transmitted. And this is how we're going to conclude this video. Because we do have a variety of different manuscripts that exist in relation to each other in different kinds of ways. So one of the sort of sensationalist ways that is sometimes presented about how biblical texts were transmitted is this so-called sort of telephone model of the transmission of the text. And the idea here is that, as in the game of telephone, wherein one person whispers something into someone else's ear, whispers a sentence, the next person whispers that thing. And as you go down the line, you sort of have different errors that enter into the telephone game. So that if you start with one person and you end 10 people later, you're going to have two very different sentences. Or what you end up with is going to be very different from what you start with. So there's this sort of sensationalized version of thinking about the transmission of the biblical text this kind of way, where you have one manuscript, some error or change enters in the first time that manuscript is copied, and then that error is repeated the next time it's copied with new errors entering in, so that manuscript 6 would look very different than manuscript 1. But this is really not a very helpful way about thinking about how manuscripts relate to one another. Rather, when we're thinking about the transmission of the text and what the work of textual critics is, and some of the work you will do as a textual critic later on in this semester, if you are a Greek exegesis student, is to think about how the different manuscripts relate to one another in diverse kinds of ways. So you can see in the sort of networked model, which is a better way about thinking about the transmission of the text, is that the manuscripts relate to one another in different kinds of ways so that you get sort of these stronger bonds between different manuscripts. And when scholars are sort of reconstructing the text, they have to weigh different manuscripts and different options at different times rather than just thinking in a linear form. And what this does is it really gives us a little bit more to work with as far as what the earliest texts were that we can possibly reconstruct. So it gives us a little bit more sort of certainty than skepticism that is often presented with this sort of telephone model of transmitting the biblical text.